The world of Zithera looked like a broken mirror from orbit, vast plains of shattered stone and molten glass reflecting the red light of its dying sun. The air shimmered with heat, even though night had already fallen, and a heavy scent of iron hung in the wind. Above it, the sky bled streaks of silver light, each one a promise of destruction. The meteor shower trial was about to begin. On the ridge overlooking the testing ground stood a formation of cadets, creatures from dozens of species, each trained by the Galactic Academy to survive the universe's harshest environments. They wore armor, exosuits, or simply relied on their natural biology, scales, carapaces, and organic plating that shimmered in the darkness. And among them, standing quietly, was a single human. His name was Lieutenant Ryan Cole, and unlike the others, he wore only a lightweight survival suit, matte gray and unadorned, already scarred from previous trials. His helmet visor reflected the falling streaks of the first meteors as he adjusted the strap on his wrist console. The instructor's voice echoed through the field, projected from hovering drones that circled above the cadets. Cadets of the 34th Galactic Cohort, the rules of the meteor shower trial remain absolute. You are prohibited from constructing, deploying, or occupying any stationary form of shelter. Any violation will result in instant disqualification or termination. The last word hung in the air longer than the others, and Ryan could feel it vibrating through the thin plating of his helmet. He had heard of previous trials where cadets had tried to cheat, burrowing underground or deploying emergency domes. The drones vaporized them before the first meteor even struck. The Academy believed survival was not about hiding from the storm, but about enduring it, adapting, improvising, and understanding. The first impact struck the far horizon like thunder. The ground trembled under Ryan's boots. A second followed closer, sending shards of molten glass into the air. The cadets looked up, their eyes catching the streaks of descending light. Some hissed in anticipation, their claws twitching. Others raised energy shields that flickered briefly before they deactivated them again, reminded by the rule. Ryan stayed silent, scanning the terrain before him. It stretched endlessly, flat, open, and exposed. There were no rocks tall enough to provide cover, no canyons to hide in, no caves to crawl into. The Academy had chosen this location specifically for its unforgiving emptiness. When the signal flare went up, a sharp line of blue fire cutting across the red sky, it marked the beginning. The first meteor storm came fast, like a rain of burning knives. The aliens scattered in every direction, each one following instincts unique to their species. A reptilian cadet flattened himself to the ground, his scales glowing as he absorbed heat. A fur-covered creature sprinted in zigzags, using speed as defense. A crystalline student extended limbs of hardened silica, forming a temporary dome that shimmered with reflected flame. Ryan didn't move. He watched the trajectories, his mind measuring distance and timing. The meteors fell in patterns like percussion. There was rhythm in chaos, and rhythm could be understood. He took a deep breath and started to walk. Every few seconds, the world exploded around him. Fire, ash, molten debris raining down. His visor dimmed automatically as one of the meteors struck nearby, throwing up a wave of molten dust. The shockwave nearly knocked him over. He stumbled but didn't fall. The air was thick with static electricity, and small fragments of metal glowed faintly as they floated in low gravity before cooling and dropping. Ryan crouched and reached for one of them, his gloved fingers brushing over its warm surface. It was lightweight, but magnetized, humming with residual charge. He pocketed it, more out of curiosity than plan. The other cadets shouted in different tongues, their voices lost beneath the storm. One screamed as a meteor struck too close, shattering the outer layer of his exosuit. Ryan kept moving forward, scanning the data feed from his wrist console. The temperature on the surface had spiked to over 900 degrees in some places, and the air pressure was fluctuating due to the constant bombardment. The human body wasn't meant to survive this, and yet he had volunteered for the trial. He remembered the instructor's words before deployment. "You don't belong here, Lieutenant. Your species was built for soft atmospheres and mild gravity. You'll last 10 minutes. He smiled behind his visor at the memory. Humans were not built for many things, but that had never stopped them. As the meteors kept falling, he noticed something strange. The metallic fragments from each impact didn't just scatter randomly. Some floated longer than others, held in suspension by invisible forces. The magnetic fields created by each strike twisted around the dust like invisible whirlpools. The planet's weak magnetosphere interacted with the metal-rich meteors, creating temporary zones of magnetic levitation. To most species, it was a deadly anomaly. To Ryan, it looked like opportunity. He knelt again, watching how a cluster of glowing fragments danced in the air, moving as if pulled by unseen strings. He extended a small scanner from his wrist and measured the field intensity. The readings fluctuated wildly but showed a pattern, brief stability between pulses. He realized that the debris could be controlled if he synchronized his suit's power output with the local magnetic rhythm. The thought was absurd at first, almost suicidal, but so were most human ideas before they worked. A nearby explosion threw him to the ground, scattering dust over his visor. He rolled and got up, his heart pounding. The sky was a constant sheet of fire now, and the surface had begun to fracture under the impacts. Streams of molten rock spread like veins of light through the cracks. He could see the reptilian cadet crawling toward a glowing fissure, trying to hide under the lip of rock. A drone descended instantly, humming ominously before releasing a blue pulse that disintegrated the cadet in seconds. The air smelled of burned ozone. Shelter detected. Rule violation. Disqualified. The voice of the drone was calm, mechanical, almost gentle, and then it was gone. Ryan took another step forward. He was sweating inside his suit, his pulse steady but heavy. His body ached from the heat, yet his mind was sharp. He knew what the others didn't. Panic killed faster than fire. The meteors were falling in waves, predictable in their unpredictability. The gaps between each surge gave him seconds to breathe, seconds to think. He crouched again, observing the way the magnetic fragments moved with the shifting currents. They orbited briefly, then fell, then rose again when another meteor struck nearby. It was as if the planet itself wanted to lift them, to keep them alive for a moment before letting them die. By the end of the first hour, the field was littered with craters and smoking debris. The surviving cadets were scattered, many limping or burned. The sky showed no sign of mercy. Ryan reached the base of a fractured plateau and leaned against its slope, just long enough to catch his breath. His suit's power reserves were dropping faster than expected, drained by the heat regulation system. He opened his visor slightly to let in cooler air, but was met with a rush of metallic dust that stung his eyes. He shut it quickly, cursing under his breath. He looked out across the plain and saw a meteor explode mid-air, scattering shards that glowed like sparks in a storm. The sight was terrible and beautiful at once, a rain of light over a dying world. He thought about Earth for a moment, about rain that didn't burn, skies that didn't kill. Then he shut the thought away. Sentimentality was a luxury the storm didn't allow. Above, the instructor's drones continued to record every movement. The Academy wanted to know not just who survived, but how. Survival wasn't enough. They wanted adaptation, creativity, intelligence. Ryan understood that better than most. The alien cadets were bred for endurance or speed, for resistance or camouflage. But humans were made to think, to fail, to learn, and to rebuild in the next breath. As the night deepened and the next wave of meteors began, Ryan stood again, shoulders squared, eyes reflecting the falling fire. He no longer feared the storm. He respected it. He saw its pattern, its logic, its rhythm. He knew the planet wasn't his enemy. It was a puzzle, one that could be solved if he could understand the pieces. The floating fragments around him shimmered faintly in the dark, waiting for someone to give them purpose. And for the first time since the trial began, he smiled. When dawn came on Zithera, it brought no light, only a dim copper horizon and clouds of metallic ash rolling across the plains. The meteors had slowed for a few hours, giving the surviving cadets a thin illusion of calm. The ground was still trembling with the aftershocks, and the air tasted like rust and smoke. Ryan Cole stood alone amid the wreckage of the first night, surrounded by steaming craters and shards of blackened metal. His visor's internal display blinked with red warnings. Suit integrity, 68%. Oxygen reserves, moderate. Temperature, unstable. But he ignored them. His mind was fixed on what he had seen before dawn, the strange way the debris hovered after impact, refusing to obey the gravity that held everything else down. That image burned in his thoughts like a puzzle waiting to be solved. High above, the drones of the Galactic Academy glided silently in orbit, watching. Their pale blue lights cut through the haze, scanning each survivor. The Academy's rules were merciless. "Shelter is failure," the pre-recorded voice had said before the trial began. "To endure, you must move." It was more than a rule, it was a philosophy. The architects of the trial believed that true survival meant adaptation in motion, not stagnation in defense. Any attempt to build protection, even momentary, was met with disqualification by death. The memory of the reptilian cadet's vaporized body lingered in Ryan's mind, a vivid reminder of what happened to those who tried to hide. He began walking again, moving across a field that looked more like the surface of a broken moon than a planet. Each step crunched through layers of crystallized sand and twisted metal. The heat beneath the surface pulsed faintly, making the ground feel alive, like it was breathing in pain. In the distance, he could see the other contestants, small moving dots against the black plain. Some limped, some crawled, some tried to keep formation with others of their species. None of them looked at him. The human had no allies here. He was an anomaly. A mammal from a backwater world who had volunteered for a trial meant for creatures evolved to survive on planets far more hostile than Earth. As he walked, Ryan's wrist console pulsed with soft light, projecting a map of energy readings. The data was chaotic. Magnetic anomalies were appearing all across the plane, fluctuating with each pulse from the planet's molten core. He realized that these disturbances aligned with the meteor impact zones. The fragments he had studied earlier weren't floating by chance. The collisions were creating transient magnetic vortices, spinning pockets of force that momentarily countered gravity. If he could find a way to harness that, he could create movement, controlled movement, through chaos. It would not be shelter, it would be survival by transformation. A new meteor wave began earlier than expected. The first streak of light tore through the gray clouds like a blade. The others followed, a cascade of fire and thunder that made the ground shudder violently. Ryan's instincts kicked in before the sensors could even warn him. He dove into a shallow crater, not to hide, but to reduce exposure to the blast wave. The meteor struck 200 meters away, the shock wave throwing molten dust high into the air. Through the shimmer, he saw one of the crystalline cadets standing motionless, his body refracting the incoming heat. The explosion hit him a second later, scattering fragments of his body like shattered glass. The drones above made no sound. The trial had claimed another life. Ryan got up slowly, dust clinging to his armor. His helmet display showed radiation levels spiking. The suit's cooling system fought to stabilize, its internal fans hissing softly. He knew the meteor activity was unpredictable, but there was a pattern. One that could be read if he observed long enough. Every impact released magnetic energy, and the fragments that hovered near the strike zones carried that residual charge for several seconds. If he could synchronize with those moments, he might create something dynamic, a shield that moved with him instead of one that anchored him in place. The Academy's rules banned static shelter, not innovation. The difference was technical, but rules, he knew, always had edges to be walked upon. He spent the next hour testing small adjustments. He retrieved a few metallic shards from the ground, thin, light, jagged pieces of meteorite alloy still humming with energy. He placed one near his wrist console and pulsed his suit's magnetic emitter at half power. The shard wobbled, then lifted slightly, spinning before dropping again. He increased the pulse frequency. This time the shard hovered longer, glinting in the dusty air. It wasn't stable yet, but it was enough to confirm his suspicion. The fragments could be manipulated. Each meteorite carried within it traces of ferromagnetic minerals enhanced by the planet's field distortion. If he could calibrate his emitter precisely, he could keep several fragments orbiting him as a mobile shield. But to make it work, he needed more material. The problem was that collecting them meant venturing closer to fresh impact sites, places where the heat could melt his suit in seconds. He stood still, watching the horizon as the next meteor wave began to glow faintly above the clouds. The choice was simple: stay safe and fail, or risk death for a solution no one else would attempt. He started running toward the glow. The sound of falling meteors was unlike anything human ears were made to hear. A low, vibrating roar that shook his bones and filled the air with pressure. The sky cracked open as molten stones rained down, trailing silver light. He reached the edge of a crater moments after one hit, the ground still steaming beneath his boots. The air around it vibrated with magnetic energy, strong enough to make his suit's sensors flicker. He crouched and began gathering the still floating shards, his gloves trembling from the charge. Each one hummed faintly as it met his hand. By the time the next meteor wave struck, he had collected a dozen pieces and retreated to higher ground. He set the fragments in front of him, activating his wrist console's emitter field. The shards began to rise again, drawn upward like metallic leaves in a storm. They hovered for a moment before drifting apart. The field needed balance, too much power, and they scattered, too little, and they fell. He adjusted the polarity, syncing it to the magnetic fluctuations of the planet's crust. This time, they held steady, orbiting his position in a slow, uneven spiral. He felt a surge of quiet triumph, the kind that came from solving something impossible while death hovered nearby. The trial drones moved closer, scanning his position. He could hear the faint hum of their propulsion systems above the wind. For a brief second, he feared that his experiment might be seen as a violation, that the Academy might interpret his creation as shelter. But the drones did nothing. The rule was clear. Only stationary constructs were forbidden. His system was in motion, dynamic, fragile, and temporary. He wasn't hiding. He was adapting. The realization fueled him. He began walking again, testing how the fragments responded to movement. The orbit faltered at first, some shards colliding or drifting away. He caught one mid-air, recalibrated the field strength, and adjusted the suit's magnetic balance to accommodate walking speed. Slowly, the fragments began following his rhythm, hovering around him like a metallic constellation. Each one spun faster when another meteor fell nearby, absorbing the kinetic shock instead of shattering. Sparks danced across their surfaces as plasma particles from the air discharged harmlessly against them. It wasn't perfect. Some pieces still fell, but it was enough to protect him from the smaller debris raining from above. As he continued through the wasteland, the other cadets noticed. Some turned their heads, their eyes widening through their visors. To them, the human looked like a moving storm, a figure surrounded by glowing fragments of metal drifting in an unseen orbit. One of the insectoid cadets shrieked in disbelief, shouting something in her native language. Another, reptilian and wounded, tried to imitate the effect by tossing shards around his body, but the fragments fell lifeless to the ground. Ryan's system required control, rhythm, and understanding of the magnetic pulse, a sense of timing only a mind trained to see patterns could achieve. By the time the third meteor wave began, Ryan was ready. The sky ignited once more, and the surface lit up like an ocean of lava. He braced himself, expanding the orbit of his fragments by increasing the emitter range. The meteors struck around him, their impacts throwing up dust and plasma. Each time a fragment intercepted debris, it flared brightly, taking the force and spinning faster. The orbit adapted, shifting position automatically as he walked. The fragments were no longer just protection. They were alive with motion, dancing to the planet's magnetic heartbeat. When the storm eased again, Ryan stopped to catch his breath. His suit's power cells were draining faster than he had planned, but he didn't care. For the first time, he had something that worked. He looked up at the drones circling above. They watched silently, recording. Somewhere in the Academy's observation chamber, instructors were studying his data in disbelief. No species had ever attempted to manipulate Zithera's magnetic field for survival. To them, the planet's chaos was an obstacle. To him, it was a tool. As he stood there, the floating shards glowed faintly around him, orbiting in steady rhythm. He realized the simplicity of it. The trial was never about strength, endurance, or biology. It was about the mind. The rule of no shelter wasn't meant to punish. It was meant to reveal who could redefine the meaning of shelter entirely. And as the red sun began to rise over the molten horizon, Ryan understood that for the first time, the Academy's law didn't confine him. It challenged him to invent something beyond it. The second night fell with a heaviness that pressed on the horizon like a closing hand. The planet's surface still glowed faintly from the last meteor storm, its heat rising in waves that distorted the air. Ryan Cole moved through the haze, his suit covered in a layer of fine metallic dust. Around him, the fragments of levitating metal shimmered faintly, orbiting at irregular intervals. They looked fragile and chaotic, but he could feel the rhythm forming between his pulse and the planet's magnetic field. Every few minutes, he adjusted the frequency of his wrist console, refining the synchronization that kept the fragments aloft. The more precisely he matched the planet's pulse, the more stable his moving barrier became. He walked across the scorched plain, the soles of his boots cracking thin crusts of cooled glass. The silence between meteor waves was deceptive, dense, alive with static energy. Each gust of wind carried the scent of burnt rock and ozone. He could hear his own breathing inside his helmet, slow and steady, as he monitored the faint hum surrounding him. The fragments vibrated softly, responding to the magnetic fluctuations of the atmosphere. They were not mere debris anymore. They had become something like companions, alive through his will, following him in orbit as though bound by invisible threads. He stopped near a deep fissure that cut across the plain. The rift pulsed with molten light far below, throwing reflections across his visor. He crouched and extended his gloved hand toward the edge, releasing a small probe into the chasm. The device descended slowly, recording electromagnetic readings. His console displayed erratic values, sharp spikes of energy followed by drops to near zero. The magnetic field was unstable but rich in potential. If he could channel part of that current into the fragments, they would gain kinetic motion instead of passive levitation. That meant he could turn defense into offense, movement into precision. The thought filled him with a cold, scientific excitement that eclipsed fear. He retrieved the probe and walked toward higher ground, his body aching from the relentless heat. His power cells were depleting faster now, but he had already accepted that every improvement came at a cost. Near the ridge, he found a collection of newer meteor fragments embedded in the rock, still glowing faintly from impact. He knelt and began pulling them free one by one, their surfaces too hot even through his gloves. Each fragment vibrated with its own magnetic signature, like a heartbeat in metal. He arranged them on the ground in a circle and activated the emitter field again, linking them to his main console. The fragments lifted slowly, aligning in a pattern more deliberate than before. Ryan increased the pulse frequency, watching as the pieces began to rotate. Their orbit expanded and contracted rhythmically, the glow intensifying with each surge of energy. The pattern was mesmerizing, fluid, elegant, controlled chaos. He stepped into the center of the circle, and the fragments adjusted instantly, forming a rotating barrier around him. His suit sensors flickered from the electromagnetic interference, but his eyes remained fixed on the moving shield. Each piece followed a trajectory of its own, yet all moved together, bound by balance. He could walk forward, and the formation would follow, curving like a metallic halo that drifted in response to motion. He tested it under strain. He picked up a small rock and threw it into the orbit. The nearest fragment responded instantly, deflecting it with a burst of sparks. He threw another from a different angle. The opposite side shifted to block it. The fragments were learning the rhythm of his movement, adapting faster than he anticipated. He felt a deep satisfaction settle inside him. Not triumph, but a quiet acknowledgement that his idea had life. Far above, the drones continued their silent surveillance. Their blue optics flickered as they transmitted data back to the observation station orbiting Zithera. Ryan had no idea what the instructors thought of what they saw. He doubted they understood it yet. Most alien cadets relied on biological instinct, muscle, or adaptation through evolution. He had none of that. What he had was calculation, an ability to see cause and effect in the chaos of natural law. Humans were not stronger, faster, or more resilient, but they were problem solvers. That was what the Academy had never fully accounted for. Hours passed as he refined the shield's rotation. He calibrated each fragment's polarity until the orbit became nearly silent, the shards gliding effortlessly around him. When the wind picked up, it carried streams of magnetic dust that shimmered through the gaps, tracing faint trails of light. The scene was hauntingly beautiful. A lone figure walking across a shattered planet, surrounded by a constellation of metal stars that moved as one. His steps echoed faintly, each one punctuated by the hum of the magnetic field adjusting to the terrain. Then came the tremor. It began as a low vibration beneath his feet, rising into a deep, resonant rumble. The ground ahead of him split open with a sharp crack, sending a shockwave across the plain. Ryan staggered backward, the fragments reacting instantly, forming a denser orbit to absorb the blast. Molten rock sprayed upward, but his barrier caught most of it, the impacts creating bursts of light like miniature explosions. He steadied himself, watching as the molten debris cooled against the spinning metal before falling harmlessly to the ground. For the first time, the shield had reacted without his manual input. It had anticipated danger. He realized that the fragment's internal charge had begun to synchronize with one another. The electromagnetic field wasn't just responding to his emitter, it was responding to itself, amplifying the connection between the pieces. What began as a crude survival mechanism was evolving into a self-sustaining system. If he could maintain control, he might create a formation that adapted autonomously to environmental threats. If he lost control, the result could be catastrophic. He adjusted his power levels carefully, lowering the output just enough to keep the formation stable. As night deepened, the next meteor storm approached. The warning flashes appeared first as faint streaks in the upper atmosphere, followed by the thunder of approaching fire. Ryan positioned himself in the open, his shield humming with anticipation. The first meteor struck nearby, throwing molten dust in every direction. The fragments reacted immediately, closing ranks and rotating faster. The air filled with fiery streaks and debris, yet he stood untouched in the center of it all. Each impact lit up the fragments with red and gold light, transforming the shield into a moving sphere of radiance that absorbed and redirected destruction. Other cadets saw him through the storm. Those still alive stumbled through the wasteland, their armor glowing from heat, their movements desperate. To them, the human surrounded by floating fire looked like a myth, an impossible survivor defying the laws of both nature and the Academy. One of the avian species shouted his name through the comm network, disbelief in her voice. Ryan didn't answer. His focus was absolute, his mind aligned with the rhythm of energy around him. The meteors rained down harder, the ground bursting apart under the relentless bombardment, yet his orbit held firm. The intensity of the storm reached its peak, and for a brief moment, the entire horizon glowed white. Ryan's visor darkened automatically, shielding his eyes from the glare. His shield was spinning at maximum velocity, the shards weaving patterns of molten light as they intercepted impact after impact. His sensors went wild, overwhelmed by interference. He couldn't tell if he was standing still or moving. He could only feel the pulse through his body, each beat matching the vibration of the fragments. It was no longer just a defense system. It was symbiosis. When the storm finally subsided, the silence that followed was deeper than before. The fragments slowed, returning to their calm orbit, their glow fading to a soft amber. Ryan's hands trembled slightly as he looked around. The ground was littered with new craters, and the air shimmered with residual heat. His power cells were dangerously low, but the formation remained intact. He had survived another trial, not by breaking the rule, but by bending it beyond its intended meaning. He knelt briefly to catch his breath, staring at the horizon where the next storm brewed in silence. The shield hovered quietly around him, humming with low, steady energy. He realized then that his invention had changed more than his survival. It had changed the nature of the trial itself. The meteor shower test was designed to destroy passivity and expose weakness, but through thought and adaptation, he had turned it into an experiment in creation. The planet no longer felt hostile. It felt alive, an environment that challenged him not to endure, but to evolve. Ryan rose again, the metallic halo drifting with him as he walked forward. The fragments adjusted to his pace, following his motions seamlessly. Above, the drones continued their silent orbit, recording every second. Somewhere, far away, the instructors must have been watching in disbelief as the human walked beneath the storm of a dying world, carrying his own moving sky of molten steel. The third night on Zithera came without warning. The heat of the planet's core had risen, and the ground glowed with faint lines of molten energy as if veins of fire pulsed beneath its crust. The air was heavier now, charged with an electric density that made the skin crawl even through the suit's insulation. Ryan Cole could feel it in his chest like a second heartbeat, an invisible rhythm that pulsed in perfect harmony with the magnetic field surrounding him. The orbiting fragments around his body moved quietly, humming in synchronized motion. What had started as improvised survival had evolved into something far more complex, a moving intelligence of magnetized matter that seemed to anticipate his every move before he made it. He climbed a ridge of glassy rock and stopped at the top, his visor reflecting the stormlight building on the horizon. The meteor showers no longer appeared as isolated streaks of fire. Instead, the entire upper atmosphere shimmered like a living ocean, waves of molten fragments gathering into formation. It looked almost sentient, as though the planet itself had decided to fight back. He checked the console readings. Electromagnetic interference had reached its peak, enough to disrupt even orbital communication. The drones that once hovered above the field now struggled to maintain control. Some spun out of formation, their glowing optics flickering before vanishing into the ash clouds. Ryan understood that this was no ordinary meteor surge. The data scrolling across his visor confirmed it. The storm's magnetic flux was amplifying exponentially, feeding off its own energy. Every meteor impact was creating a feedback loop with the planet's crust, charging the atmosphere beyond measurable limits. It was no longer a trial, it was evolution in motion. The planet was changing, and his survival system was part of that change. The thought filled him with both awe and dread. The first shockwave hit before he could brace himself. A wall of heat slammed into the ridge, forcing him to dig his boots into the rock to keep from being thrown down. His shield reacted instantly, contracting into a denser sphere that deflected molten debris. The fragments moved faster, glowing white-hot as plasma splashed across them. Sparks scattered in every direction like rain made of fire. Ryan's power cells screamed under the demand, red indicators flashing across his visor, but he held his ground. The fragments were no longer obeying precise command inputs. They were responding to instinct, or something resembling it. Each piece reacted before he even adjusted the controls, anticipating the trajectory of incoming threats with unnatural precision. When the wind picked up, it carried with it streams of glowing dust that clung to his orbiting barrier, fusing temporarily before being burned away by friction. The air temperature rose past survivable levels, forcing the suit's cooling system to divert power from the emitter field. His vision blurred as the display flickered, but through the haze, he noticed something new. The orbit was changing shape, not because of his input, but because the fragments were reacting to one another. Their movement wasn't random. It was deliberate, fluid, almost communicative. He whispered softly inside his helmet, "You're learning." His voice sounded strange, swallowed by static. The fragments answered in motion, shifting closer together, realigning their paths until they formed a perfect spiral. The configuration stabilized, and for a brief moment, the heat dissipated around him. It was as if the formation had developed an understanding of balance, redistributing thermal energy to maintain its own survival. The storm intensified. The sky split open with streaks of light that fell not as single meteors, but as clusters, swarms of incandescent metal tearing through the atmosphere. The ground erupted with every impact, shock waves rolling across the landscape like rippling thunder. Ryan began to move downhill, guided only by instinct. The shield expanded again, rotating with high-speed precision as meteors detonated around him. He no longer had time to think about input values or field calibration. The fragments were doing that on their own, adjusting magnetic polarity faster than any human reflex could match. At the base of the ridge, a massive meteor struck less than 100 meters away. The explosion lifted him off his feet and hurled him backward. He hit the ground hard, sliding across molten dust that scorched the outer layer of his suit. His vision dimmed for several seconds, then returned, flickering with static interference. The shield was still active, spinning violently, but now it glowed brighter than before. Too bright. The fragments were fusing, drawn together by the overwhelming charge saturating the air. Their edges softened and began merging into molten shapes, forming a single pulsating ring of metal that revolved around him like a miniature storm. He tried to reduce the emitter power, but the control system refused input. The magnetic field had become self-sustaining. The shield no longer needed his guidance. It was using his own energy as fuel. His heart raced as he realized that he was standing inside something alive, something aware of its own structure. The ring expanded again, reaching several meters across, sparks trailing off into the air like fragments of lightning. The field lines rippled outward, deflecting incoming meteors before they could even approach. For a moment, it felt like victory. For a moment, he believed he had transcended the purpose of the trial. Then the field began to pull. The magnetic current reversed polarity without warning, dragging loose metal from the ground toward him. The fragments clanged against the barrier, melting into it, feeding its mass. The field's hum deepened, vibrating through his chest like a mechanical heartbeat. His wrist console went dark, overwhelmed by feedback. His entire body felt like it was being stretched between gravitational forces, his limbs trembling from the strain. He fell to one knee, his breath ragged. The shield that had once protected him now threatened to consume him. It was absorbing everything: heat, energy, debris, even the static from his own body. He had to regain control before the system reached full overload. His hand moved toward the emergency power cutoff on his chest panel, but the electromagnetic pressure made his arm heavy, uncooperative. Sparks danced across his glove as the suit's circuitry began to fry. He gritted his teeth, forcing his fingers to close around the switch. But before he could pull it, the storm itself reacted. The largest meteor yet struck a few kilometers away, creating a shock wave that rolled like a tidal wave of plasma. The impact ignited the surrounding magnetic field, setting the air ablaze with pure energy. The light was blinding, flooding his visor with gold and red. For an instant, the field around him flared to its full potential, transforming into a sphere of molten brilliance that expanded outward like a living star. The force hurled debris into the sky, tearing the crust apart. Inside that sphere, Ryan could barely move. The noise was deafening, a chorus of roaring fire and electromagnetic resonance. Yet beneath it, he heard something faint, something like the low hum of a voice. It wasn't language, but it carried intention. The fragments pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, responding to him. They weren't malfunctioning. They were evolving through him. The storm had awakened a pattern of behavior, an imitation of survival derived from his own persistence. He forced himself upright, shouting through the static, "You're part of me, not my enemy." Whether the fragments understood or not, the pull around him weakened slightly. The sphere's expansion slowed, and the blinding glow softened into a deep crimson. He could see the orbit forming again, this time tighter, more stable. The molten metal hardened, cooling rapidly into dark fragments rimmed with glowing veins. The structure looked alive, an organism of steel and fire that moved with purpose. He stood surrounded by the aftermath of the storm, the air filled with drifting embers. The shield hovered around him, silent and watchful. He reached out his hand toward one of the glowing fragments. It drifted closer, orbiting his palm for a second before moving back into formation. The connection between them was no longer mechanical. It was biological in its precision, reactive in its empathy. The magnetic field was now an extension of his nervous system, responding to his emotions as much as to his commands. He felt a strange calm settle over him as realization dawned. The trial had ceased to be a test of endurance. It had become a dialogue between man, machine, and the violent will of a living world. Zithara wasn't punishing him, it was teaching him. The storm had not turned sentient in defiance of him. It had mirrored him, evolving from his struggle, learning the essence of human adaptation. He had forged a shield not only from metal and magnetism, but from the very principle that defined his species, the capacity to turn chaos into creation. He looked up at the blood-red sky, still trembling with distant meteors, and whispered, almost to himself, "Now I understand." The fragments pulsed once, acknowledging him in silence, and resumed their steady orbit. The world around him smoldered in ruin. Yet within that ruin stood something new, a union of instinct and intellect, born from destruction itself. The storm had turned sentient, but so had the man who survived it. The dawn that followed the sentient storm was not the soft birth of light known to gentler worlds. It came like the slow unveiling of fire, an ashen horizon blooming into molten gold. The sky was still alive with distant meteors, but their frequency had diminished. The planet was breathing again, slower now, as if exhausted from the rage of the night before. Ryan Cole stood in the aftermath, surrounded by a wasteland of glass and scorched metal that stretched beyond the visible horizon. His moving shield hovered quietly, no longer glowing with violence but humming in low resonance, orbiting with deliberate calm. The fragments had cooled into hardened shapes, streaked with iridescent lines, evidence of the fusion that had nearly consumed him. They followed him still, obedient but not mindless, drifting like silent guardians in the dawn haze. He took a slow breath, feeling the weight of fatigue in every muscle. His suit's systems were in critical condition, oxygen reserves dangerously low, cooling system failing, power cells nearly empty. The console displayed endless warnings, red symbols flashing like heartbeats of desperation. Yet he was alive. Every alien cadet who had started the Meteor shower trial was gone. The storm had claimed them all. The observation drones that once circled the arena now lay in pieces across the landscape, their optics shattered by the electromagnetic surge that had blanketed the planet. The silence that filled the air was total, broken only by the faint hum of his shield and the low whisper of cooling wind across glassy sand. He looked to the horizon where the Academy's orbiting vessel should have been visible, but there was nothing. The communications network had collapsed entirely. He was alone. For a moment, a strange thought crossed his mind. If no one had survived to witness this, Did his victory even exist? But he dismissed it almost instantly. The purpose of the trial was never to impress instructors or earn medals. It was to prove something, to the universe, to the other species, to himself. He looked at his hands, blackened from heat, trembling slightly as the last reserves of adrenaline faded. Humanity's weakness had always been its greatest strength. The inability to accept limits had pushed his kind to tame fire, cross oceans, and climb worlds. On Zithera, that same defiance had kept him alive. He began walking toward the nearest ridge, guided more by instinct than direction. The terrain was uneven, sculpted by impacts and molten flows. The fragments followed him effortlessly, adjusting their orbit as he moved, casting long, wavering shadows across the ground. Each step echoed through the empty plain. He no longer feared the silence, it felt earned. As he climbed, the rising sun revealed the destruction in its full, terrible beauty. The ground shimmered like liquid metal, and rivers of cooled glass reflected his movement. Far in the distance, a massive crater marked where the largest meteor had fallen, its edges still smoking faintly. He knew he had to reach it. The trial's observation post, the recovery beacon, would have been positioned near the central impact zone. As he descended into the crater basin, the air grew hotter again. The metallic dust floated lazily, shimmering with residual magnetism. His visor filters struggled to keep up with the glare. He scanned the ground, searching for any sign of surviving technology. A faint pulse appeared on his wrist console, a weak beacon signal struggling through interference. He followed it across the basin, weaving between ridges of crystallized metal, until he found what remained of an observation drone. Its core still blinked faintly, buried under shards of fused alloy. He knelt, brushing the debris aside with shaking hands. The central data crystal was intact. With careful precision, he detached it and linked it to his console. The display flickered before stabilizing, projecting fragments of recorded data, readings from the trial, visual feeds from orbit, telemetry from every cadet who had participated. He scrolled through the data. The list of life signs was almost empty now. Only his ID code remained active. He paused, watching the feed of his own telemetry replay. The moment his fragments formed the shield, the fusion surge, the sentient reaction, the explosion that had erased the storm. The recording ended with a burst of static. The Academy would see this eventually, when the retrieval teams returned. They would see that he hadn't built a shelter. He had built something alive. He had obeyed the rule in the most paradoxical way possible, by turning motion into protection, by transforming vulnerability into creation. He closed the display and sat quietly for a moment, staring into the smoldering basin. The heat waves distorted the horizon, and for a brief moment, it almost looked like the surface of an ocean back on Earth. His thoughts drifted to memories of home, cold air, blue skies, water instead of molten dust. He had not thought of Earth for days, but now its memory returned not as longing, but as perspective. Humanity had always been defined by smallness, by fragility. Compared to the other galactic species, humans were frail, short-lived, and unarmored. Yet that same fragility had forced them to adapt faster, think deeper, and build stronger. The storm of Zithera had merely reminded him of what his species truly was, a race that made meaning out of chaos. A sudden pulse from the fragments interrupted his thoughts. They tightened their orbit, reacting to something unseen. He turned his visor toward the horizon and saw the faint shimmer of movement, small, flickering lights descending through the atmosphere. Retrieval pods. The Academy had sent them. For a moment, relief washed through him, but it was quickly followed by unease. How could he explain what had happened here? Would the instructors even believe that the storm had turned alive, that he had survived by merging his own energy with the planet's magnetic field? The trial had rules, and even when he followed them, he had rewritten them in a way no one intended. The first pod landed several hundred meters away, kicking up a storm of dust. Its hatch opened, releasing a group of robotic sentinels. They advanced toward him slowly, scanning the environment with blue beams of light. When they reached him, one of them extended a mechanical arm and projected a holographic display in front of him. The emblem of the Galactic Academy shimmered above a block of text. Trial complete. Cadet Ryan Cole. Status: alive. Rule compliance: verified. Assessment: evolutionary adaptation beyond parameters. He stared at the message, the words almost unreal. The machines had no understanding of what he had achieved, only that he had survived without shelter. That was enough for them. But for him, it was something more profound. The storm had not been a test of endurance. It had been a conversation between species and nature, between instinct and invention. He had learned that survival was not about resisting destruction, but transforming it into function. The moving shield was not just a tool. It was a metaphor for humanity itself, imperfect, unstable, always learning, always moving forward. The sentinels gestured for him to enter the pod. He hesitated, looking one last time at the fragments orbiting him. The machines detected them too, attempting to classify them as foreign material, but their sensors failed to read any known structure. The fragments pulsed softly, as if understanding what was happening. He raised his hand, and they slowed, descending around him in a gentle spiral. One by one they cooled completely, settling into the sand. He placed his palm against one of them, feeling the faint warmth that still lingered beneath the surface. It felt like the heartbeat of something that had shared his struggle, something that existed because he refused to die. He whispered, "Thank you," and turned away. The fragments remained still, glowing faintly as the retrieval pod doors closed behind him. Inside, as the pod lifted into the sky, he watched through the viewport while the world of Zithera grew smaller. The crater basin shimmered like a wound sealed by glass. Above it, the thin clouds glowed red with reflected sunlight. He realized he was witnessing the end of a story that would never truly be understood by those who only read reports. The Academy would analyze his data, dissect his methods, and turn his improvisation into curriculum. They would call it ingenuity, perhaps even evolution. But none of them would feel what he had felt when the storm spoke through fire and magnetism. None of them would understand the silence that came after, the silence that wasn't emptiness, but clarity. When the pod broke through the atmosphere, the view shifted to the void of space. The stars stretched endlessly, cold and perfect. Ryan leaned back against the seat, exhaustion finally pulling him down. His console flickered with a final notification: mission archived. He closed his eyes and let the hum of the engines blend with the faint echo of his shield in memory. For him, the trial had ended long before the pod arrived. It ended when he learned that survival was not about walls or weapons, but about motion, connection, and transformation. The human principle was not strength or resistance. It was creation born from chaos, meaning carved from ruin. On a planet of storms and fire, he had built something that moved with life itself. As the stars drifted past, he smiled faintly and whispered the only truth that mattered. We don't survive because we're strong. We survive because we adapt. The light of Zithera faded into the distance, leaving behind a world changed forever by the touch of one human who refused to stop moving.